Good morning, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. It is my great pleasure this morning to welcome you to the UNCITRAL Colloquium on climate change and international trade law. 2 years ago, at the 54th session of UNCITRAL, we had a proposal from the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance and the United Kingdom proposing that UNCITRAL should examine how existing UNCITRAL texts could be aligned with climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience goals, and also whether further work could be done by UNCITRAL to facilitate those goals in the implementation of those texts or through the development of new texts. There was broad support for that proposal, and the Commission then requested the Secretariat to consult with interested states with a view to developing a more detailed proposal on this topic to present to the Commission for consideration at its next session. And last year at the 55th session, the Secretariat presented a study on various links between climate action under the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement and the law of international trade, that is to say, business and commercial law, which fall under the mandate of UNCITRAL. The Commission considered those studies at its 55th session last year and requested the Secretariat to organize a colloquium or an expert group on the various legal issues surrounding climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience in conjunction with relevant and interested international organizations. And the results of all of this would facilitate the Commission's consideration of the work that could be done at a future session. So at the time, there was wide agreement within the Commission on the importance of the topic and on the usefulness of exploring how UNCITRAL could offer its own contribution to the international community's efforts to combat climate change and mitigate its effects by updating existing private law instruments and developing new enabling legal mechanisms, if appropriate. It was observed that global efforts to combat climate change were an integral part of the agenda of the UN, and therefore, as a subsidiary body of the General Assembly, UNCITRAL is well placed to undertake work on those aspects of climate change that fall within its mandate. And it would be expected within the UN system that UNCITRAL would provide its contribution to support the efforts of other UN bodies. The views last year differed with respect to the scope and the focus of such work. The importance of corporate responsibility was highlighted, but there were expressions of caution as to the feasibility of work in that area, calling for the Commission to not focus work on tools to facilitate litigation against corporations for climate change-related damages. With respect to private law issues relating to carbon trading, the Commission's attention was drawn to various international initiatives and regulatory activities that called for close cooperation and a delineation of possible UNCITRAL work, and that includes proposals for future work by UNIDROIT, and we can note that ISDA's proposal went to both organizations. And so the Commission concluded last year by requesting the Secretariat to conduct further research in the area in consultation with outside experts and interested organizations from both within and outside the United Nations system. It also requested the Secretariat to organize a colloquium, as I said, or an expert group meeting on the legal issues in conjunction with other relevant and interested international organizations, and the aim of all of this is to facilitate the Commission's consideration of this topic, and we will do so during this session and in the future. I think that you will agree with me that the Secretariat has done an excellent job in putting together this colloquium. We are grateful for the participation of so many expert and well-informed speakers. And I am confident that over the next 2 days, our discussions will be extremely interesting. I think they will be very thought-provoking and ultimately very useful in clarifying the type of contribution that UNCITRAL can make to international climate action. So at this point, I am very pleased to declare that our colloquium is open, and I will give the floor to our secretary to introduce the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom's mission to the UN here in Vienna, Ms. Nicola Murray. So, Madame Chevin-Bret, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It gives me great pleasure to give the floor now for her welcoming address and introduction to Ms. Nicola Murray, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom's mission to the United Nations and other international organizations in Vienna. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the UNCITRAL Secretariat for organising this colloquium, and my thanks to the Chair and the Secretary for kicking off what I hope will be a fascinating 2 days of discussion. As the Secretary already said, I am Nicola Murray. I am the Deputy Permanent Representative of the UK mission in Vienna, and we cover the waterfront in terms of the work that the UN does here in Vienna. But as a lawyer in my previous life, I am delighted to be back in a forum with so much legal expertise in the room. The UK, as you will be already aware, supports the work of UNCITRAL, and we're strong advocates for global trade, and we respect the values of UNCITRAL's core business to harmonise the rules that govern that trade. We were very pleased to offer our support to the creation of this colloquium. Global trade and the interconnection that it brings is a proven driver for change. So this is an ideal opportunity to consider how to harness that driver to tackle one of the biggest, possibly the biggest global challenge we collectively face, climate change. The UK can see the opportunity, but we're also really interested in seeing the results as you explore the nexus between international trade law and the global framework on climate change. I am glad that we have impressive expertise here, including in the form of the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, with whom we co-hosted a side event during the 54th session. The Alliance has done some great work to identify how international trade law and legislative texts developed by UNCITRAL could contribute to the global response to climate change, so please do reach out to them during the colloquium. The UK was among the first countries to make the legislative commitment to reach net zero, and we remain committed to this. We have seen huge progress already in cutting our emissions by 48% between 1990 and 2019, while growing our economy by 65%. At COP26 in November 2021, the Glasgow Climate Pact saw over 90% of the world's GDP commit to a net zero target. The UK has also set out plans to become the world's first net zero aligned finance centre and published an updated green finance strategy in March this year. But beyond this, we need to mobilise green investment, align financial flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and ensure that the international legal architecture is equipped to deal with the challenges of climate change and the green transition, and that it supports, rather than hinders, countries in achieving ambitious climate action. Since COP26, the rules, modalities and procedures for the mechanism established by Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement have been adopted. And there has been exploratory work here to map the legal issues arising from the market mechanisms. This is why we are here, with this colloquium having been tasked to take a comprehensive look at the private and commercial law aspects of climate change mitigation. A pre-colloquium event, organised by UNCITRAL Secretariat, took place in London on the 19th of May 2023. Anyone who attended that event will know that we have a rich discussion ahead of us here, which I hope will touch on the areas of UNCITRAL's work relevant to climate mitigation, including procurement, public-private partnerships, dispute resolution, digitalised contracts, and even insolvency law. The opportunity is there to consider whether or not existing UNCITRAL instruments align with the global move to mitigate and adapt, and to explore the possibility of new instruments. You will hear a lot about voluntary carbon markets. Such markets are cross-border, largely unregulated, and lack harmonised principles, standards and practices. Beyond carbon removal, the investment in carbon reduction also carries myriad opportunities for greater harmonisation and uniform approaches and practices. So there is clearly plenty to discuss, and the opportunity to make a difference on this important issue. I look forward to hearing your valuable insights into how international trade law can support the achievement of our climate action goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. And I think at this point we can turn the floor over to our secretary again, and we'll get going with the rest of the day.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me first of all to welcome each and every one of you to this colloquium that has been organised by the UNCITRAL Secretariat at the Commission's request and which is taking place during our Commission's 56th session. I would also like to welcome all those who are joining us online. For this colloquium, you will also be able to take the floor online, which was not the case during the Commission session. Just a few comments now to, first of all, thank all the panelists who have travelled here to Vienna in order to share with us their views and their experience regarding the link between combating climate change and international trade law to promote and facilitate international transaction as well as the smooth functioning of market mechanisms. Naturally, we'd would also like to thank all of the panelists who will be joining us using Zoom. This has become a way of participating in the fight against climate change, thus enabling each of us to make our contribution where we are able. And allow me now to thank also the moderators, in particular Ambassador Martinsen, Mr. Ignacio Tirado, Wendy Miles of Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, and my colleagues who have also agreed to help moderate all of these sessions over the next 2 days. And briefly, allow me also to thank the Secretariat and its team who designed, developed and organised this colloquium led by Angelo Estrella Faria, and you will recognise his input in the various panels to take place and the subjects to be addressed. And then finally, a big thank you for all of the efforts in preparation for this great day now taking place. Before you, either on your desks or on your screens, you will have the programme. I won't take up our valuable time to detail the sessions to you. And I also would like to thank in advance the interpretation who will do their utmost to ensure this smooth running of the colloquium. As the legislative body of the United Nations General Assembly, UNCITRAL cannot afford to ignore the general mobilization of states and indeed of the entire United Nations system when it comes to combating global warming and the disastrous impact that this has on our planet and on our children. Thus, it befits us to consider how to best contribute to the commitments made by the international community in this regard and to see how international trade law can equally contribute to combating climate change. I would also like to thank the United Kingdom and its representative here for having placed their trust and confidence in UNCITRAL in order to start addressing this subject, and indeed this began some 2 years ago, and for hosting us in London at the pre-colloquium meeting. I do indeed have a great deal more to say, but I do feel it would be better for us to start our work right off and to start with our discussions. You have the floor, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, Madame Joubin-Bray. Now, before we begin, I would like to give the floor to our Secretary, Estelle Faria, to provide us with some updated information regarding the program.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Just one announcement concerning the organization of the program. You had originally foreseen in panel 4 to have a presentation by Mr. Diego Mauricio Herrera Falla of the Inter-American Development Bank. He's unfortunately not able to join us in person. His colleague Tatiana Alves, who's also speaking panel 3, will deliver his own remarks, but we also have obtained the kind agreement of Ms. Lisa DeMarco from IETA also to join us in person in that panel. So we have, again, that panel also with 4 speakers that had been originally anticipated when conceiving the program, and we thank her for her willingness to join us at such short notice. Thank you very much for that. Madam Chair, we have provided for coffee breaks today. It may be that if we're delayed, there will be no official coffee break. It's just a change of seats in the podium. Those that need refreshment are welcome to gather their refreshments outside the room in case we don't have time for that. With that, Madam Chair, and also thanking our colleagues interpreters for their willingness to handle 2 presentations online that will be made in the course of this colloquium. We understand that puts a special strain on them due to sometimes not ideal quality of audio. So thank you all very much. And last but not least, Madam Chair, the distinguished delegates would have seen a kind invitation by the Embassy of Paraguay to a side event that is sponsored by that embassy that will take place after our proceedings today with an ensuing reception. And we thank you for giving kind consideration to that invitation and for attending that side event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And so let us proceed then to some musical chairs, and we'll invite the first panel to come forward and take your places. Thank you.
Muy buenos días.
Good morning, everyone.
To having been invited to moderate this panel, this first panel of the UNCITRAL Colloquium on climate change and the law of international trade, entitled "The Role of Market Mechanisms under the International Framework on Climate Change." This first session will provide a general overview on the international framework for climate action under the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, with a focus on the role envisaged for the private sector, in particular through market mechanisms for emission reduction and the promotion of clean investment. I will introduce now, and I apologize in advance for shortening your CVs that are really, really rich and enlightening, but in order to save some time, I'll try to be brief on that. Allow me now to introduce our keynote speaker of this first panel, Ms. Jeanette Nazareth, who is the chair of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, an independent governance body for the voluntary carbon market. Ms. Nazareth has decades of experience in financial services regulation and corporate governance, having served as a commissioner of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. She currently serves as senior counsel at the global law firm Davis, Polk & Wardwell. Ms. Nazareth, Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. The climate clock is ticking, and while the 1.5-degree limit is achievable, it will require a quantum leap in climate action. These are the words of UN Secretary General Guterres earlier this year. And while I certainly can't phrase that any better myself, today I hope to share some insight into how voluntary carbon markets can help us achieve this goal, as well as what we need to do together to unlock their potential. We all know that the fight against climate change is a truly enormous task, a shared goal that transcends markets, sectors, portfolios, and geographies. It is crucial not just for the stability of our economies and our financial markets, but to protect the future of our society and our communities. Each of us must be fully committed and keenly focused on accelerating emissions reductions and removals to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. The scale and urgency of the climate crisis demand that we fully utilize every available tool. Emission reductions are the centerpiece of this. Decarbonization by corporates in their own operations and supply chains are a priority. But unfortunately, it is too late for us to rely solely on corporate internal emissions reductions or even government action. As Secretary Guterres said recently, we need everything, everywhere, all at once. It has become increasingly important that in addition, we accelerate climate action by investing in high-quality projects across the globe that would not otherwise have occurred, which reduce or remove greenhouse gas emissions. To quantify the opportunity, the World Economic Forum projects that the voluntary carbon market could remove 2.6 gigatons CO2 by 2030, and Morgan Stanley projects that it could reach almost $100 billion in volume by 2030. For those who haven't yet been exposed to carbon markets, let me provide a very brief overview. I hope that my summary not only adds to your understanding of this important market, but also has relevance to your work as leading international trade lawyers who advise on all manner of sophisticated cross-border transactions. In a nutshell, a carbon credit signifies a ton of carbon that is eliminated from the atmosphere. This can be by preventing emissions or removing carbon already emitted. The carbon market permits companies to contribute to climate mitigation above and beyond merely reducing emissions to the full extent possible within their own value chains. When correctly utilized as part of a net zero plan, carbon credits can be purchased as a complement to internal emissions reductions. There are two markets for carbon credits, as you likely know. Most of you are probably familiar with the compliance market, in which governments set emissions targets for companies in a given sector in the form of carbon allowances. Here, companies that exceed their targets can sell their excess allowances, while those who fail to reach their target must purchase allowances to compensate. Most sectors and geographies, however, are not covered by a compliance market. This is where the voluntary carbon market comes in. In the voluntary carbon market, companies purchase credits directly from carbon crediting programs, such as a Vera or a Gold Standard, for instance, who intermediate between program developers and purchasers. Carbon crediting programs issue credits subject to standards that they establish for projects that reduce or remove emissions from the atmosphere. This enables companies to contribute to climate mitigation beyond their own value chains, for example, where the technology does not yet exist to enable them to fully decarbonize their own operations. The voluntary carbon market, as you know, is an international market. Purchasing high-quality credits brings urgently needed capital from purchasers, nearly 90% of whom are in the global north, to projects, nearly 90% of which are in the global south, that reduce or remove carbon from the atmosphere. For example, at the launch of the Africa Carbon Market Initiative, which is ACMI, where I serve on the steering committee, President Ruto of Kenya announced that he wants carbon credits to become a major export industry for his nation. And for Africa as a whole, this is not just about climate and finance, but core development goals as well. The ambition is to reach 30 million green-collar jobs by 2030 and around 150 million by 2050. So if we get it right, the voluntary carbon market holds the power to unlock urgently needed finance that would not otherwise occur for projects that can reduce and remove billions of tons of emissions. But today, the quality of credits being traded on the market is inconsistent. Trading is fragmented and opaque. Not all carbon crediting programs impose high-quality standards. Ultimately, it is fair to say that the voluntary carbon market as we know it today does not consistently meet the needs of purchasers or the urgent needs of our planet. This is a significant problem that creates a lack of confidence in the market, limiting its full potential to help mitigate our climate goals. So that is where we at the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, or the ICVCM, come in. The Integrity Council seeks to increase the integrity of the voluntary carbon market and to lay the groundwork for the markets to scale so that it can meaningfully contribute to reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Crucially, at the Integrity Council, we seek to address some of the critical issues that have arisen in these relatively nascent, unregulated markets. First among these is the need to build trust in the market through consistent, high-quality standards for carbon credits. I know many of you in this audience can appreciate the issues that arise from a lack of standardization of rules of engagement in cross-border investment across a sector. Differing rules of engagement and highly bespoke transactions do not provide an environment for liquidity and transparency. Indeed, they create challenging market impediments. We at the Integrity Council have tasked ourselves with bringing harmony to this fragmented landscape. We are an independent governance body committed to establishing a high-integrity voluntary carbon market that can deliver real impact at speed and scale. Now, the primary way we're doing this is by creating our core carbon principles, known as CCPs, as well as the associated detailed assessment framework. The core carbon principles we developed are intended to serve as an international benchmark for high-integrity carbon credits. To bear the CCP label, carbon credits must adhere to a number of rigorous requirements that apply at both the carbon crediting program level as well as to the carbon category, in other words, the methodology level. There are 10 core carbon principles that generally fall into 3 categories: those that relate to emissions impact, to governance, and to sustainability. I won't go deeply into the specifics of each here today, but to give you some concept of the requirements, emissions impact covers matters such as the requirement that the emissions reductions or removals be additional, meaning that they would not have occurred in the absence of an incentive created by the carbon crediting revenue. They must be permanent. They have to be robustly quantified and only claimed by one party. Therefore, there's no double counting of the credits. Another set of principles relate to governance. Carbon crediting programs have to have effective governance to ensure transparency, accountability, and continuous improvement, and the overall quality of the credits. They have to operate and make use of a registry to track credits. They must provide comprehensive information on crediting activities that is digitally accessible, and they must have requirements for robust third-party validation and verification of mitigation activities. And finally, some of the CCPs relate to the very important requirement to ensure industry best practices on social and environmental safeguards, including involving Indigenous people and local communities, while delivering positive, sustainable development impacts, as well as a requirement to contribute to the net zero transition. These core carbon principles are accompanied by an assessment framework, which sets forth how to operationalize the CCPs and provides rigorous decision-making and decision tools for each CCP. We also have issued an assessment procedure which sets out, among other things, our process for assessing CCP eligibility and how the Integrity Council will continue to enforce and oversee the CCPs. In March, we issued the CCPs, the assessment framework as it relates to the carbon crediting programs and our assessment procedure. We're pleased that we will soon issue the remainder of the package, which we call Release 2, which will be the assessment framework as it relates to the carbon categories or methodologies. We expect to immediately commence our important implementation work thereafter, and we hope that the first programs will apply for the CCP label and undergo our assessments by late summer, and we will immediately begin our assessment of the carbon categories. To issue a carbon credit in the CCP label, both the program that issues the credit as well as the carbon category must satisfy our criteria. Our sincere hope is that by later this year, we will see the first of many carbon credits issued with the CCP label. One of the many benefits of the CCPs is their ability to provide clarity and simplicity to buyers. Regardless of which carbon crediting program issued a credit, its type or its geographical origin, the CCP label will serve as a clear indicator of its high integrity. This consistency will build trust, eliminate market fragmentation, and instill confidence in buyers that their investments are supporting projects that genuinely contribute to emission reduction. The demand for high-integrity credits is already evident, and many anticipate that these credits will trade at a premium to many of the credits that trade today. This should create powerful incentives for project developers to enhance their practices to come in line with the CCPs. Furthermore, the establishment of the standardized criteria through the CCPs will facilitate a shift towards increased transparency and exchange-based trading. With greater standardization, a larger proportion of carbon credit trading will transition from bilateral agreements to transactions conducted through exchanges. This transition will not only enhance market efficiency, but also provide a platform for buyers and sellers to engage in fair and transparent pricing, driving broader market participation and liquidity. By implementing the CCPs and encouraging market participants to embrace high-integrity credits, we are creating an ecosystem where the value of emissions reductions is appropriately recognized and rewarded. This will unlock greater investment flows, drive innovation, and catalyze the development and deployment of impactful climate solutions. We see the achievement of high integrity in the voluntary carbon markets as a journey, which is why continual improvement is at the heart of our approach. The urgency of the climate crisis compels us to act promptly, building on best practice and recent improvements in the market. And we are keenly aware of the need to accelerate progress towards our goals. We have already begun planning the next version of the CCPs, which we anticipate launching in 2026. And we are already signposting to the market in advance a number of areas of higher ambition in which we believe best practice and current science will warrant even more rigorous standards in our next iteration. Furthermore, we are launching a number of multi-stakeholder work programs to tackle thorny issues or areas of innovation. By continually raising the bar through regular and rigorous curation of the CCPs and assessment framework, we can maximize the potential for a high-integrity carbon market that will drive real, impactful change. Our commitment to progress is rooted in sound regulatory practices and a shared understanding of the challenges we face for ongoing adaptation and innovation. Now, you may wonder why I use the term regulation in the context of a voluntary carbon market that is not regulated by government bodies. This is because at the Integrity Council, we believe that our framework will only succeed if it is rooted in sound regulatory principles. and operates as closely to a regulated market as possible. We recognize the benefits of regulation, but we also realize that governments cannot work quickly enough to address the urgent need for high integrity in these markets. Thus, as private sector actors, we have stepped in to address this need. Yet we welcome the inputs of regulators and hope that if governments ultimately do act to regulate this activity, then our framework can be seamlessly transferred with minimal market disruption. We also believe that our framework can effectively work alongside, among other things, disclosure regimes, such as the ISSB. Our focus on integrity extends beyond the supply side of the voluntary carbon markets. As you may know, we're working in tandem with the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, or VCMI, to ensure integrity throughout the entire market, encompassing both the supply of credits and their utilization. We're calling this end-to-end integrity. The VCMI recently launched a claims code of practice, providing a rule book for companies on how to make credible claims about their progress towards net zero commitments using carbon credits. A key principle of that code is that companies can only make credible claims if they select credits that meet stringent quality thresholds aligned with our CCPs. By fostering end-to-end transparency and integrity and encouraging companies to invest in high-integrity carbon credits, we can drive a more rapid and impactful transition toward net zero emissions. These efforts will not only support individual companies in achieving their sustainability goals, but also contribute to the collective global efforts to combat climate change. So to summarize, I hope I've made clear both the urgency and the tremendous opportunity for high-integrity carbon credits to accelerate our transition to net zero through international trade in the voluntary carbon market. I invite companies, investors, NGOs, and all stakeholders, including all of you in this room, to join us in operationalizing a vibrant, dynamic market that can fulfill our critical goal of tackling the climate crisis today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. The next speaker of this panel is Mr. Philip Eyre, who is the team leader of the Markets and Non-Market Support Unit within the Mitigation Division of UNFCCC. Mr. Eyre has over 20 years of experience in carbon markets as a market compliance regulator, both at the UNFCCC and at previous roles in Australia. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. In my presentation today, I'm going to be covering off, trying to explain in 10 minutes UNFCCC accounting. And 10 minutes is not really going to be enough, but I will try. And as a result, it's probably going to be at a relatively high level. So I'm going to focus on, if it works. No. There we go. Okay. Essentially, I will give you a very quick introduction to the flexibility mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol, very, very quickly, because these are ones which, essentially, with this year's true-up period, essentially are coming to an end. So it's kind of just to give you the flavour of the system that we are coming from as we move into the new system under Article 6. And then I'll also give you a very quick introduction to, as was already previously mentioned, the mechanism established in Article 6, Paragraph 4. So under the Kyoto Protocol, just to give you the overall structure, there were different approaches. There was the international emissions trading under Article 17. There was joint implementation under Article 6, and the clean development mechanism under Article 12. Within this framework, under Kyoto, there were a defined number of units. So every unit had standing and was described within the international system. We had the AAUs, which amounted to the budgets of each of the Annex 1 countries. We had removal units, which could be generated from afforestation, reforestation activities, or Article 3 LULUCF activities. if a country has chosen that at the beginning of their commitment period. We have emission reduction units, which are basically from JI and are conversions of AAUs and RMUs into a ERU, emission reduction unit. And we have certified emission reductions. And these are sort of additional compliance units that come from non-Annex 1 countries that can be used for compliance in KP. To give you the overall view of the sort of the system, every country, every Annex 1 country had a registry, and in those registries were the units were held. So we had a system where every Annex 1 registry, every Annex 1 country had a registry, and the CDM registry existed in order to create the units from the CDM. And we had the international transaction log that provided the tracking and approval of transfers throughout the system. So the CDM were forwarded through the international transaction log to Annex 1 registries, where and amongst Annex 1 registries, international emissions trading happened. CERs could again be re-forwarded or retransferred between different Annex 1 countries, and they could trade AAUs, they could trade ERUs, and the like. All of this was in the, was essentially a closed Kyoto system. Everything was known in terms of where every single unit was, and in a way, all the compliance units that could exist were within one of these repositories of compliance units. Near the end of the commitment period 1. What we started to see was also this desire for the use of the CDM for voluntary cancellation. And so this was then allowed within the CDM registry. And that was the first element which came in, and that mainly went towards the desire for climate neutrality claims. We then had a number of countries come afterwards, particularly South Korea, in respect of its emissions trading scheme, where it wanted to use CERs from both Korea and outside of Korea, and they adopted an approach of having a cancellation of the units in CERs and reissuing them into the Korean registry. We also have seen other policy measures being developed in other countries, such as South Africa and Colombia, where the cancellation of a CER can be used for compliance and towards a carbon tax. They don't actually need the unit. What they need is the attestation of cancellation as evidence to do so. And that's a similar approach that gets used in Corsia in the future. For compliance, under Kyoto was also quite straightforward. The total quantity of AUs may have been determined by your budget, but compliance was based on simply the sum of your inventoried emissions across your commitment period, and then you had to retire. 5 minutes already. You had to retire enough units to meet your compliance obligation. Only 3 slides in. Okay, so I'm going to have to be a little bit quicker. Under the Paris Agreement, what we have is essentially 3 elements of international cooperation. I'm going to focus on the cooperative approaches and the mechanism established in Article 6.4. And these are essentially the carbon market elements of Article 6. And we also have the framework for non-market approaches, which doesn't involve trading, but can also utilize potentially some A46ERs as results-based finance in a non-market manner. My presentation also wanted to touch on a couple of key concepts around Article 6. So I wanted to focus on, what is an ITMO? What is authorization and why is it important? What is first transfer? As well as give you the view of what the tracking and reporting system under Article 6 looks like, since you've just seen what it did look like under the KP, and then give you sort of a very, very quick introduction to 6.2 accounting, principally on the emissions-based approach. So essentially, an ITMO is not defined. It is not a unit or a thing. What we have in paragraph 2 of the Glasgow outcome was characteristics. It's a description of what ITMOs should have. Sorry, I'm not clicking through. And what we also have is within these, we have elements that go to what makes the ITMO mitigation. So it has to be real, it has to be from emission reductions or removals, it has to be measured in a metric of the parties, it has to be after 2021. And then we have elements of its its legal status. It's recognised as an ITMO by the parties through authorisation and through authorisation process. And within the description, there is a unique element of the reference to the A46ERs, which is the Article 6 for emission reductions. And that is possibly the only thing within the list of what an ITMO is that is actually a unit. Moving to authorisation. Authorisation comes from Article 6, Paragraph 3. Effectively, it is that this was a handshake in Paris that no mitigation can be purchased and used by a party without the approval of the host party or the originating party. It was to ensure that at the time, and there still are programs where subnationals and activities in the voluntary market are involving in the purchase of mitigation, but the host country doesn't have any involvement in that. And so this is where authorization comes in. You need government approval, essentially. The effect of authorization, and in this aspect, there are still ongoing discussions in terms of what the authorization needs to contain, what information, when does it need to be submitted, and that is still discussions in our subsidiary body and going towards the CMA this year as well. But effectively, the effect of the authorization is an entitlement for the using party to make an adjustment to their starting balance of emissions in the structured summary and use it effectively towards the achievement of their NDC. It also creates a corresponding obligation on the first transferring party to do the same but opposite corresponding adjustment in the structured summary for first transfers. This is where it brings me to what then constitutes a first transfer, and we do have a fairly convoluted description of first transfer in paragraph 2 of our text, and it simply goes to the first one is very straightforward. International transfer is a transfer between parties when it's for NDC compliance purposes, and that's fairly straightforward. But we then have this issue around what is called other international mitigation purposes, which in UNFCCC language is code for ICAO and IMO and for CORSIA and for whatever potentially may come out of IMO in terms of if they adopt a market-based approach. And for these ones, the issue there was in most of the approaches, there was no actual, particularly for CORSIA, there's no actual international transfer of a unit to the airline because it's not between parties, and there's only corresponding adjustment by host parties. So it doesn't come in on the use side into the structured summary. And so we needed to capture this idea that you have international transfer even if it's being purchased and cancelled within the one registry by the project participant without ever leaving that project participant's account. And the other aspect to it is that the ITMOs, particularly on first transfer, have to be accounted on the vintage. So even if I first transfer a unit in 2028, but the mitigation occurred in 2023, when I come to the structured summary, the adjustment I will make is to the 2023 inventory column. And I'll explain that a little bit later. Now, in terms of, the tracking under the new system, what we have is all countries need to have a registry or have access to a registry, and we have two models of these registries that are evolving within the system. We have a system that is built around having a registry that pulls information from underlying registries and effectively tracks information. So you will track information in multiple registries and you use your national registry to just mirror the information, so it doesn't hold units particularly. And then there is another view around, which is much more similar to Kyoto, where registries will actually hold units and be connected directly in similar ways to under the KP, and the units themselves will flow between units. And again, this is still under discussion. In terms of what the tracking is for, the tracking essentially is there to enable a party to generate its annual agreed electronic format. And this is essentially an annual report of transactions that occurred in the previous year. And this is where we find out how many first transfers there were, how many uses, how many have been used for Corsia. This is where it comes in to the Secretariat. We do a consistency check to ensure that the units are matched against each other, and essentially this consistency check is to ensure that if an acquiring party is recording and reporting an acquisition of units, there is a first transferring party that has already done it. And so if an acquiring party details an acquisition and we can't find a corresponding first transfer record, then that also gets flagged as an inconsistency within our system and flagged to the countries. The data also then flows into essentially the structured summary. This annual information of first transfers, of uses, goes in together with your inventory, and it creates your emissions balance. This system is then reviewed by Article 6 technical experts, which provides the assurance and trust in the system that everyone is doing the required corresponding adjustment. The experts will cross-check to ensure that the aggregate numbers are there, and if a country in their AEFs and in the database is stating X amount of first transfers in a year, but when they come to their structured summary it's not consistent, that then gets flagged as part of the Article 6 review. And that's where assurance, so that both parties can ensure that if I'm buying something and using something, I know that within the system, the other counterparty will have to do the corresponding adjustment upwards, or it will be flagged as being inconsistent. And again, I know I'm going over time, but this is Article 6. We've always gone over time. In terms of accounting, and this is where it gets to the real. And again, I stress that this is a very high level and illustrative example. These are essentially the rows that come out of, and they're the important rows in the structured summary for where corresponding adjustment and Article 6 accounting actually happens. Sorry, there. You essentially have your starting balance, and this is your emissions and removals covered by your NDC, and it is derived from your inventory. Or it's a subset of your inventory if your NDC doesn't cover your entire inventory. You then have to add and report all the first transfers that you've done in a year. And now this first transfer includes the ones for other mitigation purposes, but we have them reported separately for transparency. And we do this again because they're only reported by the host party as first transfers. We then have countries that have used. We have, and this in this respect, so first transfers are vintage based, as I said. So a 2023 mitigation must be adjusted to the year 2023 column. Whereas for use, you can use the vintages across the entire NDC implementation period as a using party, and you have that flexibility. We then have some complications at a very high level. We have two different types of methods to deal with single year targets. There are issues around making sure that a country's behaviour in the year of its NDC target, being a single year target, is consistent and representative of its behaviour in the markets across the whole in NDC implementation period. And that's to ensure environmental integrity of what they do, and they're not just doing adjustments in the target year. So they have to do them across the whole period, and the way to address this is parties have to either nominate a trajectory, and for every single year they need to compare their adjusted emissions to that trajectory for the year, or they need to use a rolling average. And then so that at the end of the year, in your target year, you only use the average that you've used, and the average is the cumulative divided by the 10-year NDC implementation period. That then, depending upon what method you do, is what you then apply to calculate your emissions balance. And in the end, that emissions balance is then what you will use in the calculation of your indicator for tracking of progress, particularly where this is greenhouse gas based. If you don't use the adjusted emissions balance, you end up double counting. So in the end, that's why if you have any form of indicator that is based on GHG, it is the adjusted emissions balance as a result of your Article 6 that you need to use in that calculation. And finally, I know that there's a very short time in terms of the introduction to the Article 6 mechanism. Effectively, this is the new centralized UNFCCC baseline and crediting mechanism. It replaces CDM and JI, and I say it replaces CDM and JI because it also changes its scope from being just for non-Annex 1 countries, but for all countries. So any country can host a project. I won't go through the aims, and they're just a replication from Article 6.4. And again, I said this, but what I wanted to do focus on is under 6.4, we have the possibility of 2 units. And this is where it becomes, we have 1 unit that is clear. It's the authorized emission reductions. It's those emission reductions that have received an authorization by the host party. These are ITMOs when they are first transferred, and they have to be reported into the structured summary and included in the AEFs. We have a second type of unit, which is the mitigation contribution unit. Now, this one is not an ITMO. It's not authorized. It doesn't require the host country to do a corresponding adjustment. It can be used for results-based finance. It can be used for domestic pricing schemes or domestic price-based measures. It can be used in domestic emission reduction purchase funds, or in carbon taxes or ETSs, as we previously saw with the CDM. And it can also be used for contributing to the reduction of emission levels in the host country and to claiming of that contribution to the reduction. And with that, I will hand back, and I apologize for going over time.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Mr. Søren Lytken, who is a senior economist from Denmark. He has a master's degree in business administration and a PhD in corporate investment strategies related to the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. Mr. Lytken has been engaged in private sector investment in the carbon market for more than 20 years. He currently serves at UNEP, managing the Clean Development Mechanism loan scheme in UNFCCC. Mr. Lytken, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, organizers, participants, good morning. And thank you for the invitation to speak at this colloquium. Mr. Nazareth and Mr. Eyer have already lined out the scene excellently. I will try to provide observations from somewhere between a market actor and a theoretical analytical perspective that I've built from 20 years of working in different capacities in the carbon market. So I should also underscore that to the extent that I present or express any views here, they are entirely mine. They are not UNEP's. My point of departure is environmental integrity, and Ms. Nazareth and the Integrity Council, in that regard, we were sharing definitely views and approaches. It is central to carbon trading. If a buyer of a carbon credit wants to claim carbon neutrality or just some level of emissions reduction, he needs to be certain that the emissions reduction he's buying has the same level of certainty as the emissions that he intends to continue emitting. It is, or at least it should be, a zero-sum game. But if you can question the environmental integrity, you can also question the carbon credit. If it's no longer a zero-sum game, the credit actually becomes a net source of emissions. So therefore, establishing this certainty has been central and a central challenge from the very outset. In the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, the prime concept to ensure environmental integrity was additionality. It's also the most contended issue of CDM. And I wrote 250 pages of PhD thesis on the subject, so I know it's not trivial. Fundamentally, we need to be sure that the project for which we are issuing credits would not have happened in the absence of a carbon market. Already here we have a problem, because how can we be certain of an alternative reality? Well, because we cannot. What we are really talking about is not additionality. It's deemed additionality. And in order to deem additionality, an additionality tool for CDM was devised. The tool would help you determine if your project could pass as additional. The tool allows 3 different approaches. You would need to pass one of them. And I think they're here. So either your project would have to prove that it's not common practice. That means it would have to be one of the last 5 additions to whatever activity is going on. If it was being a common practice, you could not use that part of the additionality tool. Or you would have to prove that by registering the project as a CDM project, you would pass an identified barrier. You, of course, should identify the barrier yourself. Or you would have to pass a financial additionality test with an IRR benchmark. The financial additionality was the most used, and several approaches were allowed for the financial analysis, including different benchmark setting methods for internal rates of return on equity. I won't go into detail on this, but it became rather complex, and for that reason, at some point, a waiver for additionality proof was granted to small-scale projects. If project activities would generate less than 60,000 tons of CO2 reduction per year, they did not have to prove their additionality, although, of course, they still had to be additional. But for smaller projects, we demonstrated a willingness to grant ourselves at least some leeway on the environmental integrity. Now, for many project categories, we are in fact not trading in actual emissions reduction. We are trading in avoided emissions. The system does not differentiate between the two. So let me just take energy projects because they are oftentimes the easiest to get your head around. When you put up a wind farm, assuming you have now passed the additionality test, you also need to establish how much that wind farm is accomplishing in terms of emissions reduction. It is not that you demolish a coal power plant, and put up a wind farm instead. I mean, at least that would be the very rare case. But that would actually be real emissions reduction. But the world is not that simple. Instead, what you replace is the average of future additions to the electricity grid. So how do we know that? Again, it's something we need to decide, because how can we know? To help us, we decide that the grid emission factor, which is the amount of CO2 emitted per megawatt hour produced on a particular electricity grid, represents what would have happened on the grid. That would be the business as usual. But already 20 years ago, we were aware that power generation was changing character, so we refined the approach. Another tool was devised, tool number 7 we have arrived at. And that introduced 2 different grid emission factors. One is the operating margin. That is the average emission factor of all generators on the grid. And the other one is the build margin, which is the average emission factor of the 5 recent additions to the grid. So the latest projects that were put on the grid. Because the recent addition to the grid would be more likely for replication than the average, which includes power plants that are maybe half a century old, you should use a combination of the two, the combined margin, as the baseline. The baseline is what the project should deviate from. The difference between the baseline emissions and the project emissions is a reduction in future emissions that the project can be awarded. Now, because the trend in many countries is shifting towards zero energy, the build margin moves towards zero. And if you have the 5 last projects being wind projects, the build margin is zero. Nevertheless, in these countries, you still may be able to generate carbon credits, not because you are closing down existing fossil fuel plants, but because in theory, you may still be replacing fossil fuel plants on the future generation capacity, simply because you're still also using the operating margin as part of the emission factor. My point here is that for many methodologies and project types, we are not reducing emissions. We are avoiding a theoretical future additional emissions scenario. And I know that by lining out challenges to a system that is sort of expiring, the CDM is not functional anymore. Some of these projects, or some of the CDM projects, may migrate into the Article 6, but most of them actually cannot. Let me turn to the voluntary carbon market, because there are two interesting developments here that deal with the baseline assumption that I just mentioned, that a project can generate credits based on a theoretically avoided emissions baseline projection. There are two main operators in the voluntary carbon market. One is gold standard, about 15%. The other one is Vera, it's already mentioned. The difference between the voluntary carbon market on one side and CDM together with the upcoming Article 6 is that CDM was approved for legal compliance with mandated emissions reduction requirements. The voluntary carbon credits were not and are not. So when we talk about the compliance market, which uses credits that are generated from UNFCCC-based mechanisms, and the voluntary carbon market, which is commonly used for self-imposed or voluntary commitments, such as companies' net zero commitments. When we talk about a tremendous growth in market and demand for carbon credits, we are actually talking about the voluntary credits. Vera and Gold Standard have taken a brave step in no longer accepting newly registered renewable energy projects except for those in 46 least developed countries. The reason for that is that for the past 10 years, solar and wind have been the least cost power generation option. So it's difficult to keep arguing that these projects need additional financial encouragement. Another recent development in the voluntary carbon market is VCS sort of reconsideration, I'd call it, of projects based on avoided deforestation, which is an obvious avoided emissions activity. Avoided deforestation has been the predominant source of credits for corporations seeking to meet their net zero targets, but in January this year, the newspaper The Guardian claimed that more than 90% of what they called rainforest credits were, quote unquote, worthless. And they based that on scientific articles from 2023. And after disputing the findings for a month or two, VCS at least indicated they were preparing to revise its rules. So it seems there's a movement away from crediting the most prevalent projects in the carbon market. And the reason is the doubt about the environmental integrity of these projects. It leaves us with a question. What are we actually selling? And can we trust what we are buying? Let me for a short moment venture further into the past. Many of you will know that the commonly referred base year is 1990. And it's compared to that countries have to reduce their emissions. When Europe says minus 55%, they mean minus 55 compared to 1990. This base year comes out of the Colloquium Protocol, and a group of countries, the transition economies in Central and Eastern Europe, found themselves with emissions projections far beyond their actual emission levels due to the industrial transition in these countries. These surplus emissions were popularly and maybe also controversially labeled hot air. And by estimates from Carbon Market Watch and Point Carbon, they amounted to a total of 13 billion tons of CO2, almost half of it in Russia. The prudence of buying these credits for compliance purposes was immediately questioned. These emissions would never happen. How could that count as emissions reduction? Green investment schemes were established to secure that the revenues from such trades were at least placed in green assets. Ultimately, the major part of this, I'll still call it hot air, was never traded. Had it all been used, all countries with reduction commitments would not need to engage in any further mitigation action well beyond 2020. And we stated that already back in 2011 in the emissions gap report. An agreement was made in 2012 on these assigned amount units, so they haven't reached the market. So fast forward to 2015. In the Paris Agreement, we have replaced the 1990 base year with nationally determined contributions, requiring all countries to project their own future emissions as the baseline. Countries are equally to commit to reducing their emissions compared to this self-determined emission baseline. When we were projecting baseline emissions in CDM, we at least had tools to determine these emissions, like Tool 7 for determining the real emission factor. Now the determination of baseline emissions is a national prerogative. If a country projects a tripling of emissions over the next 5 years, there's no tool, no system, and no board that can determine if this is reasonable, and certainly not if it's allowable. If emissions reduction is claimed on this basis, it's the equivalent of the hot air of the Kyoto Protocol. It's possible that Article 6 may help improving the environmental integrity of the ITMOs by fencing in a project activity with a boundary within which emissions are demonstrably reduced, but the corresponding adjustment may be undertaken in a budget of emissions that is never going to materialize. If so, the corresponding adjustment cannot assure the environmental integrity by equalizing emissions in national emission inventories. I'm arriving at my conclusions now. Commonly, we are equating emissions reduction with avoided emissions, but we have seen that this is increasingly, if I may, discredited. We have also seen that the systems that manage the carbon crediting frameworks is responding to criticism directed at the justification of carbon credit generation, exactly the environmental integrity. When the systems get wiser, the rules are being adjusted. All emissions reduction projects must employ approved methodologies for the calculation of the resulting emissions reduction. And of these, there are about 250. Also, the methodologies are subject to, commonly well-meant, criticism, following which they are continuously updated and refined. I think that the most revised methodology I've come across is version 13. The tools are also being revised. The tool 7 I mentioned before is version 5. When I discussed this with the executive board's chairman many years ago, he was of the conviction that the board did its utmost to provide updated guidance, whereas I maintained that for developers, it was a continuous source of uncertainty. We are now facing a new era of uncertainty in the transition of methodologies from CDM to Article 6, which is going to develop its own methodological basis from 2026, I believe, and I'm looking at the Secretariat. So correct me if I'm wrong. But it leads me to the last point I want to make. About 90% of CDM projects approve the additionality as financial additionality, not with barrier analysis and not with claiming latest technology. With revenues from the carbon market, in addition to other revenues, typically from power generation, the project would be able to raise the necessary financing. A project developer would take the power purchase agreement and the emissions reduction purchase agreement, the ERPA, to the bank and make the case for project financing. The bank would accept the PPA, the power purchase agreement, but not the ERPA, the emissions reduction agreement, as collateral. The ERPA would typically be between a reputable buyer, with a reputable buyer. When I was buying carbon credits for the Danish government in China in 2006, 7, and 8, I certainly considered ourselves as bona fide, but that was not the issue. Commonly, the developer would talk to a bank that had never heard about the carbon market. 15 years on, fortunately, that is improving. But what banks in the know see is not a trade between two trustworthy parties. They see a third party that determines whether these two parties are in possession of the product they want to trade, in the quantity and at the time they presume. But the banks see a systems risk. When the Executive Board revised methodologies, they saw an update of a method according to the latest knowledge. The banks saw uncertainty. When the Executive Board introduced a requirement for proof of prior consideration demonstrating that emissions reduction was a driver in an early investment decision, they saw pursuit of environmental integrity. The banks saw uncertainty. And when the Executive Board rejected 50% or more of some project types like waste heat recovery, they saw enforcement of the additionality tool, but the banks saw uncertainty. Because the system must constantly pursue environmental integrity and is willing to revise the rules as and when required in the service of this objective, it cannot at the same time hope to inspire trust in a banking sector, the preoccupation of which is risk avoidance. When at the same time the civil society remains the only but also unpredictable and efficient guardian of the environmental integrity of future trades in emissions reduction based on, say, avoided emissions or inflated emissions baselines, the financial additionality of project can at least be questioned. I know that I've provided many questions and no answers to what we are selling and if we can trust what we are actually buying, and I believe that we all strongly would welcome any contribution to solving this from UNCITRAL and other integrity institutions that have this as their focus as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lutgen. The last speaker of our panel is Mr. Thomas Clark, General Counsel of the Asian Development Bank. Mr. Clark holds a Doctor of Laws degrees from Columbia University and the Bachelor of Arts degree in Government from Harvard University. He has over 30 years of experience in legal and government affairs practice, having served as General Electric Company for 22 years, and most recently, he was Managing Director of and co-head of Americas for the Global Public Policy Group of BlackRock, the world's largest asset management firm. Mr. Clark, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and let me please begin by extending my great thanks to UNCITRAL for inviting the Asian Development Bank to participate in this extremely important dialogue on climate change. It really is the most urgent issue facing Asia and the Pacific region. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with all of you today. Having talked a little bit on this panel so far from my illustrious predecessors with regard to the international framework, some key accounting issues, some very important integrity issues, I'd like to talk a little bit about the role and vision for the private sector, and particularly coming from the ADB, the role and vision for market mechanisms and the role of multilateral development banks in helping to crowd in that private sector capital, particularly in promoting clean investments. It's very hard, I think, to one-up, and I will not even try to one-up the Secretary General in his statement about the clock is ticking, but I will say that we have a regional version of that, which our President Asakawa of the Asian Development Bank has often said, which is that the battle against climate change will be won or lost in the Asia and the Pacific region. This is because the Asia-Pacific region accounts for over 50% of global emissions, much of it coming from coal-fired power plants, and what climate actions the region takes will have significant implications in the global climate fight. At the same time, Asia and the Pacific region has 7 out of the 10 countries in the world most vulnerable to climate change, environmental stress, and natural disaster. Climate change threatens to actually roll back decades of progress in the region, exacerbating inequalities, having a disproportionate impact on the poor, on women, and on other vulnerable populations, potentially raising poverty levels and putting hundreds of millions of lives at risk. This will only worsen without concerted and collective action. Unfortunately, climate action is falling short currently in Asia and the Pacific. The current nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, and GHG trajectories are projected to result actually in a 16% increase in emission levels in Asia and Pacific by 2030 compared to 2010, according to UNESCAP. Obviously, that is going in the wrong direction. Now, there are numerous reasons for this, including insufficient climate finance to meet NDC targets. And for some developing countries, of course, their ability to implement their NDCs are conditional on attracting greater international climate finance. Hence, back to what I said at the beginning, how can we mobilize that private sector finance which is needed? Furthermore, net zero pledges have yet to be translated into real policies, laws, and concrete action plans. For instance, only a few of the countries in our region have passed laws to commit to net zero. These include Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and I'm happy to say Fiji, which has done that with the help of some technical assistance from the ADB. Others have policy documents in place in 15 countries, and the balance have made pledges but no specific policy documents or laws yet in place. And additionally, many countries in the region face significant challenges in transitioning their economies due to a lack of infrastructure, space, resources, and capacity. So recognizing the diversity of ADB developing member countries, ADB has tried to take an approach looking at different legal regimes and capability and requiring us to take differentiated approaches across different countries. So in response, what have we done? First of all, we've stepped up as the Climate Bank for Asia and the Pacific, committing to a number of key initiatives. We're aligning our financing with the mitigation and adaptation goals of the Paris Agreement for 100% of our sovereign operations and 85% of non-sovereign operations by this month. And that's 100% of non-sovereign operations coming in by July of 2025. We're raising the committed target we had of $80 billion in climate finance from our own resources to be committed within 2019-2030 to a $100 billion ambition, with $66 billion to be invested in mitigation and $34 billion invested in adaptation. We're also supporting a number of private sector initiatives with $12 billion out of that $100 billion ambition in cumulative climate finance from our own resources for the period 2019 to 2030. So we're looking at how we can ensure that actually 75% of our own operations do have a particular support for climate change mitigation or adaptation. This is something that is very critical to achieve within this decade. Now, I think it's important to note that as much as we've stepped up our own actions, we and all of the other MDBs, even all of the public fists of our developing member countries, are a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed. And so that mobilization of private sector capital is critical. And we're looking at different forms of collaboration that can help to attract this, including through new philanthropies and private sector coordination. We have a recently approved innovative finance facility for climate in Asia and the Pacific, which is looking to leverage our own resources and then crowding in $4 for every dollar invested by ADB with the support of guarantees extended to ADB by a number of our member governments, in turn freeing up more of our balance sheet for climate action. And we hope that this facility will crowd in an additional $9 billion in private sector climate investment. We're also expanding the universe of partners teaming together with us on climate action to include philanthropic organizations through innovative blended finance mechanisms. How do we look at blended finance? Well, some recent examples of these look at broad ranges of structures, from large utility-scale renewable energy project financing to smaller-scale pilot and demonstration structures. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor of some of these, we've recently deployed several debt tranches that offer a combination of concessional tenors and pricing alongside market-priced MDB and commercial debt to address the key bankability gaps, an example being the recently signed 600-megawatt monsoon wind power project in Laos. We've been finding ways to use contingent grants and standby debt facilities to mitigate the curtailment risk, which is a major issue that puts a bit of a roadblock in front of some wind and solar projects in several countries. And, of course, we're looking at the use of grants and concessional loans to finance key bankability gaps in a series of geothermal projects in Indonesia. Sometimes another issue is we have projects which are bankable on their own if you look at it on an in-country basis, but they become difficult to bank because of FX volatility. To address these, we're using contingent grants to cash collateralize the FX risk for, in one example, a commercial lender of a rooftop solar project in Vietnam, enabling the offshore lender to extend U.S. dollar loans without the client being exposed to FX risk. And in other cases, we use contingent grants as a first loss liquidity reserve to finance the acquisition and distribution of less polluting things like household cooking stoves to rural communities in South Asia. So as you can see, there's a broad panoply of different modalities using, but the key thing is where can we as an MDB and with some of our partners such as philanthropies and our sister MDBs use our resources, limited as they are, to mobilize and attract more private sector capital in, which is needed to address these issues. This increasing role of the private sector is also seen in our look at transition financing in Asia.
So to expedite the early retirement of coal-fired plants at COP26, we launched a major initiative called the Energy Transition Mechanism. This combines market-based financing with concessional capital, including bilaterals and philanthropies, to achieve the necessary change in project economics. I think the thing you have to realize here is even financing renewable power projects, while good, it's not enough because you still have, as I said at the beginning, so much coal-based emissions in Asia. Retiring those early, accelerating that retirement pace is going to be critical to meeting GHG reduction targets. Let me talk a little bit about international carbon markets, since that's a key focus of our discussions here today. International carbon markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and of course the voluntary carbon market, can help attract much-needed climate finance to incentivize and catalyze these investments in low-carbon technologies and solutions from both the public and the private sectors. Now, ADB has a long-standing engagement with the carbon markets and has built very strong expertise in carbon markets and carbon pricing, such as the Asia-Pacific Carbon Fund, the Future Carbon Fund, and the Japan Fund for the Joint Crediting Mechanism. Furthermore, ADB's carbon market program supports carbon pricing initiatives and carbon market development in ADB developing member countries through a technical support facility and the Article 6 support facility, which provide technical capacity and policy development support. More recently, just last year, we established the Climate Action Catalyst Fund, which will mobilize carbon finance through carbon credit transactions under Article 6 through the purchase of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. The CACF is expected to be capitalized with about $100 million in financial commitments and commence operations this year. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the policy aspect of this, because we all know that transactional focus, it's absolutely critical, but we need to look at the long game. And as I said at the beginning, one of the major hurdles here is that fewer countries than need to have adopted the right laws and policy mechanisms. So that's why one thing that our Office of General Counsel's Law and Policy Reform Program has been focusing on is supporting laws throughout the region to enable carbon markets in our DMCs. For example, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, we assisted the Fijian government with its Climate Change Act, which provides the legal framework for Fiji's engagement with the carbon markets. The Climate Change Act defines carbon sequestration rights and establishes mechanisms for recognizing and enforcing legal rights to carbon credits, regulating emissions reduction projects conducted in Fiji, and creating emissions reduction units generated under these projects. Furthermore, our Law and Policy Reform Program is working on the development of a carbon credit legal options framework to provide countries in fact, it's critical to provide these countries with the legal building blocks to regulate and support the voluntary carbon markets, which have been talked about earlier in this session, and at the same time to help those countries and the private sector mitigate their GHG emissions and contribute to improved outcomes for nature and for local communities. The voluntary carbon market is hampered, and I think this is consistent with remarks we've heard earlier, by inconsistent and absent, sometimes very vague legal and regulatory approaches to carbon projects within countries, including the legal nature of the carbon credit, the nature of the legal rights to use and sequester carbon, and approaches to government approvals for the projects. So the development of the carbon credit legal options framework will help to establish a consistent approach, and consistency here is so key, a consistent approach to the legal frameworks that regulate carbon reduction. Once the carbon credit legal option framework is developed, ADB plans to support regional knowledge and policy dialogues about voluntary carbon markets so that countries and the private sector can increase their capabilities to utilize carbon credits as a tool to attract credible carbon reduction and removal projects. In particular, we look forward to further collaboration with UNIDROIT, ISDA, and the World Bank on the legal nature of voluntary carbon credits project, a critical project in creating the legal certainty to scale up the voluntary carbon markets. Finally, let me say just a few words about strengthening the enabling legal and regulatory environment to crowd in private sector capital. The impact of public capital can be maximized, in fact, must be maximized by ensuring that legal and regulatory regimes create the necessary preconditions and incentives for private sector capital. Our experience is that certainty and predictability are key considerations here. Without them, there is very little chance of mobilizing the huge amounts of private sector capital that are needed. And for this reason, our law and policy reform initiatives are focused on areas such as corporate and insolvency law reform, the legal architecture needed to facilitate the taking of security interests by lenders, and capital markets reform, including netting issues, among others, as well as working to improve effective and efficient resolution of commercial and financial disputes and contract enforcement in our developing member countries. And this includes encouraging a number of them to accede to the New York Convention and to other conventions on arbitration. So, for example, our law and policy reform program works also with judiciaries on effective and efficient adjudication of commercial, environmental, and climate change disputes, given that these cases can be highly complex and specialized, and the benches need capacity building and sharing of knowledge across judiciaries in the region to improve their capacity. Let me speak very briefly about, just as an example here, being here at UNCITRAL, but UNCITRAL and ADB have partnered in putting in place the legal framework for international commercial arbitration in the South Pacific, where, of course, this is more critical than ever, given the presence of small island developing countries that are at the forefront of risk. And rising sea levels actually literally risk wiping these countries off the map. Together, we were successful in assisting Palau, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, and Timor-Leste, some of the most fragile and vulnerable countries, to accede to the New York Convention. And Fiji, Timor-Leste, Palau, and Tonga have put in place implementing arbitration law based on the UNCITRAL model law. And in Palau, this reform actually had the immediate impact of attracting foreign lenders to invest in solar PV and battery energy systems project as the dispute risk was mitigated for foreign investors. I'm also very happy to say that we're partnering with UNCITRAL along with the ICC and the Digital Standard Initiative on reform to recognize the digital documents for trade through the adoption of the UNCITRAL model law on electronic transaction records. This reform actually has picked up speed since the COVID pandemic. Digitalization of trade is a key priority for ADB, and we are working hard with our DMCs to create more resilient, more inclusive trade and supply chains, and we look very much to the very good models of UNCITRAL's laws, guides, and texts to advance climate action. Finally, we have to further catalyze a pipeline, because it has to be not just one-offs, but a series and a sustainable pipeline of low-carbon and climate-resilient private sector projects. And we'll continue to support our developing member countries in establishing the transparent, effective legal regulatory frameworks that can strengthen the enabling environment for mobilizing private sector finance. In conclusion, let me say that a net zero Asia and the Pacific and the world will require a diverse range of partners. I'm grateful to UNCITRAL for convening this important colloquium and presenting a great opportunity for us to come together. Thank you very much, and we look forward to engaging with you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clark. I would like to express our appreciation on behalf of all of us to the four speakers. It's quite clear we've run out of time, so I wonder if the Secretariat foresees to stick to the original program and having the coffee break now, or we just change the panel and we keep on working? Okay. So, again, thank you very much to all the speakers. Questions can be made after the second panel to the including the speakers that participated in the first one. Thank you.
Hello. Good morning to all of you. Sorry for starting so quick, and sorry for not for being here instead of the coffee break. But we are a bit tight with time. My name is Ignacio Tirado. I'm Secretary General of the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law, and I'm going to be moderating this panel. It is a great honor and a pleasure to be here again. It's been too long. Before being a UNCITRAL person, I was for many years an UNCITRAL person, and therefore I hold this house in very, very high esteem, and affection. So it's great to be here. I hadn't had the opportunity since COVID, so it's great to be here. Thanks a lot to the Secretariat for the invitation. So the colloquium covers basically all the important topics that could be relevant for international trade and the reaching of the goals of the emission goals. It has an amazing selection of experts, and therefore, again, it is necessary to congratulate UNCITRAL Secretariat, as usual, for their fantastic job. This panel will focus on a subset of topics between the big array of topics that will be covered, which concern areas which touch regulatory side, the private law side, and financial law. As was mentioned before by the General Counsel of the Asian Development Bank, UNCITRAL has been doing some work already with the World Bank and the support of ISDA on this topic. I remember we had participated in a conference in Bilbao recently on the Innovate for Climate, and there was a very good discussion on this. And this, as a consequence of this discussion, there were three elements that were considered particularly important and in need for guidance in this topic. One of them was precisely the strong regulatory component that this has. Second one was the need to have clarity and guidance as to the legal nature of a subset of these markets of voluntary, the voluntary carbon credit subset, not the compliance one, and also the necessary clarity as to the different roles that intermediaries play in the different markets. And all of this should be covered today. For this, we have an excellent set of experts with us. We have the private sector, we have international financial institutions represented, we have the regulators, and we have also the industry of the sector. And I will be introducing each of them as they speak. The order of interventions will commence with Dirk Forrester. Dirk is the CEO of International Emissions Trading Association, IETA, in its acronym, very well known in the sector, no doubt. Dirk has enormous experience both in the private sector and the public sector side. He was, just to give you an example, since now he has a position in the industry. He was for years as part of he was the chairperson of the White House Climate Change Task Force. So that qualifies him as being able to provide both sides of the question. So without any additional, Dirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ignacio, and a real pleasure to be with you today. And it's also terrific to follow such an illustrious panel that you've already heard from, although I'm trying to put myself in your shoes a little bit and think about what I would make of this complexity that you heard about Article 6 and about the various structures that countries or companies are trying to engage in pursuing the Paris goals through use of emissions markets. And I thought I would just try to fill in color in the picture a little bit in terms of sort of how private sector players view this. My organization has just around 320 members that are active in carbon markets all around the world. And those are, there are something like 73 different carbon pricing systems. Not all of them have a trading component, but many of them do. And you heard Annette in the earlier panel talk about, in terms of the focus on the voluntary markets, that is really a relatively small segment compared to compliance markets. And just to give you some flavor of that, last year, I think according to Flavia, according to World Bank numbers, the carbon pricing systems globally generated something on the order of $95 billion US in revenue. Of that, about 2/3 of it was from carbon markets, most of that in the European emissions trading program. But that's sizable. It's something on the order of, I think, around 60-something billion just in the EU alone. But there are carbon pricing systems in a lot of other places. They're also generating revenue that governments are trying to redeploy into further climate action. But the voluntary carbon market that gets a lot of focus right now, last year was 2 billion. So it's tiny compared to what compliance markets are about. And I guess that's the first message that I wanted to leave with you. For those of us that work in carbon markets, the future of it is really in more regulated markets and having more compliance systems to emerge, because right now I think we only have compliance systems covering about 23% of global emissions. I know the government of Canada is championing an effort to double that or triple that, and we would support that. That ultimately the governmental structures are a lot stronger and more durable than expecting the private sector to do it all kind of voluntarily. But there are jurisdictions where the voluntary markets are going to be vitally important. I will say in my home country of the United States, hugely important right now because we have a patchwork quilt of state-level activities, federal programs, but there's not an overarching federal carbon trading program. So a lot of corporate actors are interested in stepping forward with voluntary commitments in the U.S. that might mimic what they would do in a compliance jurisdiction. So the point one, just putting in perspective what this is, the one that's got enormous potential to scale in the near term, though, is the voluntary market. So I think that's why it gets sort of outsized attention right now. When you go to the climate negotiations, this year we'll be going to Dubai, and you talk to the private sector participants there, Article 6 is the topic that gets the lion's share of attention. The reason for that is that there's a recognition that this is the place where ultimately the net zero aims of the Paris Agreement succeed or not. And the reason for that is, if you look in the Paris Agreement and do a Google search of like net zero in the Paris Agreement, you won't find the term. Why? Because it talks about reaching a balance of sources and sinks. Well, that's net zero to many of us in the private sector, but it's a balance of sources and sinks. And you look globally at who has the potential for, inside their own borders, balancing out their sources and sinks. Not everybody's got that potential in equal measure. In fact, if we're going to get to that balance of sources and sinks fast enough and at a level that sort of meets the Paris levels of ambition, we have to work across borders. So that's where these trading mechanisms become vitally important in connecting whatever emissions are remaining in the system as we clamp down on emissions and matching those up with the removal possibilities, be it from nature or from technology. But I think in terms of the long-term vision of this, if net zero is going to work and if the Paris Agreement is going to succeed in advancing emission reductions as fast as possible and sequestering what's remaining, we have to make this Article 6 architecture work really well. So think about my members, private sector actors, they're all in your jurisdictions, right? And you're trying to make sense of what Philip was describing in the prior panel. And it's pretty complicated because, first of all, you need to know what the national NDC is, what the country is planning to do on its own, not just in this cycle, but in future cycles where you hope they're amping up their ambition so that you can know whether the emission reductions or the removals that you're buying are surplus to what they're doing on their own account. So you need to know what the national plan is. And you need some other things. You need to know whether your country is going to accept those for compliance because as Philip's presentation sort of shows, there's a action both for the sell side in authorizing a unit to transfer out of the country and account for that, but also the buy side where it lands has to also account for it so that we can know that the system is being kept whole and that those amounts are equal to each other, right? That there's not double counting or anything that gets lost in that translation. The veracity of the system completely depends on this kind of honest accounting and reporting. That's the main item, I think, in Article 6 that people focus on, is how this reporting is going to happen. And the other bits of it are around how do you assure that there's stringency in the reductions that are being made, that there's, as previous speakers talked about, the environmental integrity. I think many in the private sector have welcomed the effort that Annette talked about with the Integrity Council and the voluntary carbon market, because one of the key differences of the Paris Agreement on Kyoto Protocol is that countries can use what carbon crediting standards they choose. They've got freedom. They can use the centralized mechanism at the UN under Article 6.4, or they can actually recognize the voluntary market standards. Colombia, for example, has a carbon tax, and you can use CDM credits that are made in Colombia to comply with that tax, or you can use credits from the verified carbon standard of Vera. Similarly, in South Africa, similar approach. You can use private standard credits, or you can use the UN credits. Singapore, same way. So this is an emerging model in a number of developing countries, because you're able to borrow the infrastructure that private sector has created in the voluntary carbon market in a way that you can leverage, that's sort of globally recognized, just like the 6.4 mechanism will be. The issue right now is the 6.4 mechanism is still a work in progress. So it's got a board, it meets, but it hasn't got enough clarity yet on what methodologies will be accepted and how you would register a new project and what it would be issued into, because there's not a registry yet. So it's a work in progress, but what you can do right now are these voluntary crediting standards. So again, that's, I think, part of why countries have been accepting them. Also, many of your governments have accepted that as part of the International Aviation Agreement. So ICAO's CORSIA program, I'm trying not to use acronyms up here, but the carbon offset reduction scheme for international aviation, CORSIA, is the international body that is kind of governing international flights and credits that can be used for meeting obligations for airlines. Those, or that program, similarly to what Colombia has done and Singapore has done, recognizes both UN credits or voluntary market credits. But they have to sort of meet an annual review, a regular review of their quality assurance. So what it means is that for many of your countries, you have choices in the current system that you didn't have in the Kyoto era, right? The Kyoto era was all centralized. This is more of a decentralized model, a bit more complex, but it gives choices and gives the ability to potentially accelerate activity. So I wanted to give you just a little flavor of, therefore, against that, what has the private sector been doing to help build some of the legal systems. One is that there are model agreements that have been developed for Article 6. My organization did them both for the Kyoto era and now for the current world of Article 6. It still anticipates some of the registry systems and delivery mechanisms at a UN level, but we've got at least version 1 developed by Linklaters with a bunch of law firms in our membership. ISDA also, Peter will speak to those, also has agreements related to more the secondary market for those. So we've got model agreements in place. We also have in the registry world something that I think is incredibly valuable and important that's coming up. The Climate Action Data Trust, sponsored by the government of Singapore, my organization and the World Bank have helped to cultivate this activity. But what it does is provides registry specifications for countries that are going to build their own registries for Article 6. It makes sure that they're all done in a data format that is common, so that they can link together easily. It also provides this in a digital form that is easily accessible on blockchain, which we think is a valuable potential tool so for capturing all of the information that buyers and sellers are going to have. And it does it for both public and private. So these private markets, the voluntary standards, can contribute their data into the Climate Action Data Trust. Might sound like a really simple thing, but in carbon markets, we don't have one place you can go right now and see all of the credits being generated from the gold standard, from the VCS, from the UN. This will provide that capacity so that it's easier for your due diligence checks to go and sort of be assured that what you're buying isn't being issued more than once, or that you have all of the key specifications covered. I think these are elements of some of the nuts and bolts of what the private sector is going to need for scaling investment, but certainly much of the attention is focused on the ICVCM's threshold standard and VCMI's guidance on corporate claims, so that hopefully we can build the voluntary market to have comparable integrity to what's seen in compliance systems, but that they pave the way for more compliance systems to come into force. Because again, our goal long term is for the voluntary market to create the conditions so that more countries can adopt compliance systems that can scale to Paris levels of ambition. I think I've talked. The last thing I'll say is in the carbon market spaces that exist right now, we sort of have all of the elements that you need, I think, for operating a quality market. Especially with the advent of the ICVCM's threshold standard. We have exchanges, we have model contracts, we have national programs in formation, right? We need more of those. But really what's needed, I think, in terms of the inspiration for doing more, is for governments to provide more clarity at a national level of what sectors they want to direct, channel investment into, have their own Article 6 investment strategy. And I know that's something that many of the capacity building organizations, it sounds very similar to the ADB presentation previously about sort of legal preparedness. And I think having familiar models at a national level so that when a investor comes in that's interested in these, in potential investment, that it's not a different legal model every place you go, but in fact it's a familiar kind of an infrastructure. We did that in the CDM times. We can do it again, but again, I'd say that's where a lot of attention should be focused. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dirk. Completely on point and also on time. Right, so now what we'll do is move on to the next speaker. We're going to have now the vision of a development international financial institution. It's the time for the intervention of the World Bank that's been doing a lot of very good work in this for many years. The speaker to my left is Flavia Rosenbuch. She's a Spaniard like me. She's Flavia Rosenbuch, which is hard to pronounce. She's program manager of the Partnership for Market Implementation in the Climate Change Group of the World Bank Group. I remember many years ago when I was in DC, she was already there. I'm talking about 15 years ago, and she was the person doing these topics and climate action. So she's the one who can offer also a historic view of everything that the World Bank has been doing and is doing currently. So Flavia, please.
Thank you so much, Ignacio, and thank you so much, UNCITRAL, for inviting us and for this very timely conversation. And I'm very honored to be here. 15 years ago, I may have been in elementary school, but I was already working on carbon markets, as Ignacio has mentioned. So some of us have been working on and off on this topic for over 20 years. As you know, as our shareholders, the World Bank has been called to action, as have the other MDBs, to do more on climate. As we can feel today in Vienna, climate is no longer something we are going to worry about in the next 20 years, but it's here and it's present and it's hot and there's storms and there's hurricanes and we need to act urgently. The World Bank lent $32 billion last year on climate finance. That was 20% more than the previous year, which was already a record year. And as all of you know, the bank lends money for projects, but it also lends money for policy. In addition to our lending operations, we also have trust funds that are contributed by donor countries where we can have a specific action for climate. In the climate change group, we work upstream, we provide analytics, we provide diagnostics on the climate situation in the different developing countries. And I would invite you to take a look at our country diagnostic reports that we have been issuing starting last year. They're very, very complete analytical work on what the needs for climate finance are in each of the countries that have been evaluated. We also work what I want to call midstream, which is capacity building. As Dirk was saying, we provide technical support to governments from developing countries so that they can get ready on a number of issues, including on their Paris Agreement commitments. And we also provide downstream advice, which is the finance, specific finance that the World Bank does. The facility I'm currently managing, the Partnership for Market Implementation, provides advice. It's a capacity building facility where we provide regulatory advice to our client countries on mainly two things. One is how to get ready to access the international carbon market and how to implement or how to design carbon pricing instruments. Carbon tax. If a country like Colombia, who's one of our PMI countries, is interested in designing a carbon tax, we will help them do that. If Brazil is interested in looking at monetizing some of the reforestation, we will help them do that. So that's the big part of what the Partnership for Market Implementation does. But we also provide thought leadership, and we work with other partners. Thought leadership through the Innovate for Climate conference, for example, that Ignacio just mentioned, where it's a very narrowly defined conference where we get together private sector, public sector, developing countries, developed countries to discuss carbon markets and climate finance in a narrow sense of the word, and where we present some of the knowledge products that we also develop, like the state and trends of carbon pricing that Dirk also mentioned, which is a yearly report where we look at every single country to see whether they have adopted any carbon pricing instrument, and we look at prices of carbon, and we look at how is that evolving compared to the previous year. And I would invite you to take a look at the State and Trends report as well. It's very well written by my colleagues, and it provides a very helpful picture of what's out there. In addition, we also look at what we call innovation. We pilot. We look at where there are gaps in the market, and we work with partners to try to fill in those gaps. One example also mentioned is the Climate Action Data Trust. We realized that registries could not talk to each other. So we worked for a number of years with our partners on having a data exchange so that in one single place you can have all the information you need on the registries that become partners or members of the Climate Action Data Trust. We look at financing instruments. We just recently issued a carbon-linked bond, the Vietnam bond that was issued by our Treasury Department a few months ago. And we look at how do we enable an environment so that carbon markets can become more robust, more liquid. And for example, that takes me to the initiative that is led by UNCITRAL on providing certainty on the legal nature of the voluntary carbon credits. Why are we interested in this project? It's very selfish. We want to help our client countries. We want to help all of the developing countries that we are working with when they come to us and they say, hey, we have people knocking at our door saying, we want to buy your carbon credits. We don't know what to do. We don't know whether we should sell them to the voluntary market. We don't know whether we should wait until Article 6 becomes effective. What do we do? There's all these prices being thrown at us. We don't know what it is. We don't know what to do. But we find there's many people knocking at our door. We think that coming with some instrument that provides certainty around what these assets are, how do you trade them, what happens in case of insolvency, how do you create security over them, is going to bring certainty to the world. So it's going to help us do our job in providing support to our client countries. And I think I'm going to pause here because I think it would be interesting to leave a little bit of time for questions. And since the previous panel wasn't able to do that either, I'm going to turn over to the next speaker and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Flavia. Then we change the perspective of the discussion slightly, and we move to the more regulatory side. If there is an area where private law and regulation are blurred, is precisely in anything which concerns Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and the both compliance and especially compliance, but also voluntary carbon markets in many ways. To talk about the topic, we have here with us Benedict Nolens. She is the head of the Hong Kong Bank of International Settlements Innovation Hub. She has many years of experience both in the public and private sector as well, mostly in areas of fintech and digital matters. Therefore, she can also offer a hybrid view. I believe you have a PPT, right? The presentation that we should show.
Yeah, I think there should be some presentation material coming up. Good. Here we go.
Please.
So thank you very much for the introduction. So it's my pleasure to be here. It's actually the second time in this room. I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation because there are analogies to my being here today. So my background actually a long time ago is in law, but I moved into regulation very early in my career. And as mentioned by Flavia, green has always been on my agenda, but my whole career has been in regulation and finance. And green has always been on my agenda, including with the start of the UNPRI, then the formulation of the ESG agenda and the transparency that provides over corporates. And now I guess we've reached this phase where we need to figure out what to do with voluntary carbon markets. So my most recent focus in the last 5 years is on innovation and the use of technology. And it is within that context that I will be talking about this project that we did in the BIS Innovation Hub. For context, the BIS is the Bank for International Settlements. It is an international organization that represents 63 global central banks, so the world's leading central banks. The Innovation Hub is a new operation. It was started around 3 years ago. I was one of the first hires. And we fast inserted green finance as one of the themes that we should focus on. And this combination of the two Genesis projects was actually the first two green finance projects. So we published a total so far of 4 reports under the label of Genesis. In some, there was one with, and they have different colors, so it's easy to recognize. So the pink flower is a visionary report. It has contribution from a lot of private and public sector and NGOs in terms of seeking to define that intersection between finance and green, because you can define easily how to deal with green, but this intersection with finance is where it gets tough. And it gets tough for the reason that one of the prior speakers has defined, which is banks are risk averse. So to make them move into green, there needs to be some level of certainty, transparency, and liquidity. I think Annette mentioned that, and also one more of the prior speakers. So then we did one prototype, which we call Genesis 1.0, and it concerned the distribution of government bonds, green bonds, with a level of transparency that was being provided around the green outputs, or so to say, the use of proceeds, what green outputs like carbon credits does it actually generate. In the next year, we started a collaboration with the UN under the brand of Genesis 2.0, and there we went further in terms of attaching the carbon credits in the form of a forward to a bond. And for all of this, we used indeed blockchain, so tokenization, smart contracts, and Internet of Things. So all of these are prototypes. These reports are fully transparent and available on the internet, and you can see from it what is possible. So it provides actually a vision for the future. So first of all, let me talk about Genesis 1 for just a few minutes. My thinking process was that governments will increasingly need green finance, and they can do that through the use of bonds, through issuing bonds. And these bonds can be issued to institutional investors, but they can also be issued to retail investors. So, for example, in Hong Kong, we have an active government bond issuing process to retail investors. We hadn't, however, done a green bond to retail investors, but I think that doing a green bond for retail investors is actually increasing the community awareness and engagement. So I think it is a very good use case. Now, why did we bring in tokenization? Because tokenization by nature means that you can fractionalize the bonds much easier. So in the past, for example, within Hong Kong, the minimum investment of a classically placed government bond was 1,300 euros. Now, that's not exactly accessible for every person on the street. So by doing this tokenization and thereby fractionalization approach, we actually completely automate the government bond issuance process. And by doing so, we can go to very low denominations. In this case, we had set as a target $10 as an investment number. So it becomes increasingly accessible to the community. In addition to that, we linked the bond asset to transparency around the use of proceeds. So in this assumed case, the use of proceeds was solar panels. And these solar panels, as you know, generate predictable carbon credit outcomes. In this case, what you do is, in some, you attach IoT devices to the renewable energy sources. And by logging these carbon credits on blockchain, you actually avoid or reduce the risk of that double counting of these carbon credits being sold twice. So this is the use of blockchain for the use of what people always refer to as the provenance use case of blockchain, is you can only use that thing once because it's very clear now. It has a very clear provenance and a very clear origin to that solar plant. So for this purpose, we worked with the private sector and specifically with a startup called All Infra, which specifically is focused on this approach of logging these carbon credits on blockchain through the use of IoT devices. So the prototypes that we generate, again, are visible in the report, but this I just gave you, for example, what you could see on your iPhone. As a retail bond investor, you could see how much carbon credits have been generated. Of course, if you invest $10, that's not going to be a big credit to you, but still you could see the overall and you could see how much your investment in that sense represents. So we did 2 prototypes. Actually, one prototype was on a public blockchain. The other one was on a private blockchain. This is also a common discussion in technology, is whether you can actually do compliant things on public blockchains. And our view is that you can. You can add KYC as an overlay to these public blockchains. And so the battle is still ongoing, frankly, between these public blockchains and these permission-based ledgers. And it may end up being that if the public blockchains end up being successful, that they actually are more usable. But I wanted to make sure we look at both. So the second prototype was on a permission-based blockchain. It was integrated with a Hong Kong wallet, our main wallet, with which we can pay everything. We can pay supermarket purchases. We can pay our subway trips with this one wallet that we call Octopus. And in sum, the idea is that in that wallet, you can in the future buy such a government bond. So, as I mentioned, with the second project, Genesis 2, we changed, as you can see, the color of the lotus to orange. We did change the focus by working with the UN, and we focused on this North versus South issue. So we worked with Massamba Thioye at the UN FCCC, and the idea was, what if we can attach the carbon credits in the form of forwards, so you have a predictable carbon credit generation. We attach them to the bond today, and these carbon credits in the future will get automatically delivered. The same technology is in place that tracks the creation of these carbon credits, and through smart contract, they get automatically delivered to the wallet of the institutional investor. That's what we focused on there. The theory of the UN was that if you do that, you can move the investment to being upfront, to what Massamba used to call an ex-ante enabler of this climate agenda. So I think in sum, that was the focus there. I can give you a lot more background, but so in sum, the greenwashing thing, as you know, issue looms large. This reduces the greenwashing risk by having the IoT devices automatically track. It reduces the financing gap. You know, there's a huge gap for climate finance. That climate finance cannot just come from the public sector. It has to come from the private sector. And so this interlinkage with the VCM, with the voluntary carbon markets, and with the ITMOs, i.e. with being able to transfer these carbon credits, is important. In terms of the carbon credit pricing, this we included in the report, but you can see the differences in the pricing. That in practice shows what was being explained, as said again by Annette on one of the first panels, is if you have this kind of discrepancy, there will not be enough movement in these voluntary markets because people want to see much more transparency to create that liquidity. These are the standards that approve, so for example, Vera and Gold Standard, which approve the carbon credits. The ITMO, the linkage to 6.4, and how you can transfer these carbon credits between North and South. In fact, South to North. As I said, the bond product with these carbon credits attached. So here is a view of how we do the monitoring side, so the IoT devices. And here is a view of how, again, the investor could see on their app how the carbon credits are real time being generated. So in this case, though, an institutional investor, not a retail investor. This type of mechanism would, as said, through its transparency, improve access to finance, including for Global South issuers. And it would probably do so at a lower cost, because you have the certainty as an investor that it is not greenwashing, and you have the certainty of the automated delivery of the carbon credits. And as you all know, there is a lot of speculation or expectation that carbon credits will go up in price. So for financial markets, they always like an element where there is an upside potential. The upside potential is here in the carbon credits. So I'm going to, because I've only, I think, 1 minute left, so I'm going to focus on the last slide here, which is the legal side of things. So I would link there up with what Annette was saying and note a couple of interesting things about this market in my experience across these different aspects of finance and regulation. So first of all, we have a very interesting problem here, which is the North and South problem. So we have a generator of carbon credits that has a new potential market, that is the South. This is normally the poorer part, right? So we have actually a financial opportunity to make money in the poorer part of the world. That's unprecedented and really, really interesting in that sense. We have the North as a potential buyer. The second is we have national systems, national regimes, national compliance markets, but we have actually an always international investment market. And an investment market is never national. It has to cross borders. We have things, carbon credits, that to be investable need to be homogeneous. Yet they are not yet homogeneous. And to become more homogeneous, there needs to be more transparency. As said, we try to create this in this prototype. We have a voluntary carbon market that is completely unregulated, if you think about it. And this is the most interesting bit of it all, and that's towards the middle bullets on my slide there. Normally, a market where you trade a commodity are a security, and a derivative, for example, forward, is a security. And normally, I would view a carbon credit as a commodity. So the spot could be a regulated commodity, and the forward could be a regulated security. Normally, there should be legal certainty around the status of that thing, the carbon credit. And only if there's legal certainty will indeed the financial markets massively come into this and be able to create that access to finance that we want to create. And finally, I said the linkage there is to Article 6 and to the ITMOs and the international transfer, enabling that transfer and that flow of money between the North and the South. So in sum, I'll leave it at that because I'm out of time, but thank you very much. Thank you.
A couple of minutes more if you want.
It's okay. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. We are well with time, so that's okay. Then the final speaker in this panel will present a different vision, the vision of the financial industry. And to talk about that, we've got here Peter Werner, who is the senior counsel at the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, ISDA, who has been in the face of ISDA in international organizations in the government since I remember, and who currently devotes a good chunk of his portfolio and his time in working precisely on emission goals, climate emission goals related topics. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ignacio, and thank you to UNCITRAL for inviting us along to this very interesting and relevant colloquium, which is also very timely because of the urgency of the climate challenge, of course, as many speakers have reiterated today. The aim of my intervention is to provide an industry view, as Ignacio indicated, as a global trade association for derivatives markets, and how global legal standard setters should address this. Just to give you a little bit more color to what type of transactions I'm talking about, this is about carbon credits in transactions that are usually known as forwards, swaps, options, but also spot transactions. And what ISDA does is the publisher of the global standard contract for this type of transactions in the secondary markets, so hence the derivatives angle. So the counterparties to these transactions are usually financial institutions, corporates, but also public law entities and supranationals. And they trade under these contracts various assets, or types of assets, ranging from commercial commodities in commercial contracts, carbon credits, but also FX hedging arrangements, for example. It's all under the same contract. And the idea here is that if everything is traded under a single contract, the legal and regulatory treatment needs to be sort of harmonized as well. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a second. So my appeal is, if I can put it that way, is to the global legal standard setters to pick up the topic and come up with legal guidance around verified carbon credits, VCC, or voluntary carbon credits, as we colloquially referred to. And that's why this event today is so timely. So we've heard at the outset of the colloquium from Annette about the efforts at ICVCM level to agree on universal standards on this kind of, if I can put it that way, scientific and environmental criteria for these credits. The predecessor to ICVCM, in its final report, called on industry to produce general terms and conditions, as they called it in that report, for trading in VCCs. So this has happened in the meantime. So we've heard from Dirk that IETA have published documentation. ISDA has done so too for their respective market areas. So templates are out there. That's the first strand of law reform efforts and legal standardization that is needed. There's a second trend as well, which I'll get to in a second, which is more related to this forum here. And just to give you some color also or flavor from markets, this type of trading in carbon credits aligns very neatly with trends and growth in terms of trading in various environmental products that come in dematerialized and digital form these days. So we need to remember that, because some of these criteria are very relevant, not only to carbon credits, but also to other types of products, such as environmental products that you may have seen in your respective jurisdictions around other greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide, but also renewable energy certificates, for example, low carbon fuel standards, and the like. And from a UN perspective of particular relevance may be the future product of so-called biodiversity credits, for example, which have very similar features to the type of products we are discussing here today. So there's also another link to, if you like, traditional market infrastructure here that is key to both the carbon markets as well as kind of traditional markets. In voluntary carbon markets, there's a particular significance to so-called registries, which have been mentioned several times already earlier. And they've been in place for a while, ever since the Kyoto-style trading started. And those, in light of the policy decisions that have been made that put emphasis on trading in voluntary carbon markets, need a closer look going forward as well as to what the substantive law is that applies to these registries, and also what the regulatory treatment of this infrastructure in carbon markets as a whole is like. And now I'm getting to the second strand of law reform that is needed here. So we need to find out what the thing is that that people are trading. Benedict mentioned this for her project just now as one of the key elements. So we need to find out in particular what the legal nature of these things called carbon credits is. And that's, again, a topic which is very relevant for other types of products outside of the carbon space going forward as well. It is actually also very relevant to what was referred to earlier as compliance markets. Under cap and trade schemes that exist everywhere, the only thing I know as a market participant is the regulatory framework for these cap-and-trade regimes, and that gives me a certain degree of comfort. What I don't know is what the substantive nature of the emissions allowance, for example, to use the EU terminology here, is. I don't know this. I only know the regulatory framework, which gives a high degree of comfort, but I don't know what the thing is in terms of substantive law. And that we thought it might be useful, in addition to publishing standard documentation, to do a little bit more research into what the legal treatment, the substantive legal treatment is across 6 jurisdictions that we have selected across the globe. And we've come up with a paper, 2 papers in fact, that look at the substantive legal analysis in the US, UK, Germany, France, Singapore, and Japan. These papers are available on the ISDA website and may also be available from the UNCITRAL Secretariat. So why do we obsess about the legal nature so much? And this is because any trading to a significant scale, which is what everybody is aiming at or aiming for, will only occur once the counterparties do know what the legal treatment is of these credits, primarily for the purposes of insolvency as well as for collateral arrangements. And the practical reason why ISDA obsesses about this is because one of our functions is to publish standard legal opinions for industry that industry participants use vis-à-vis their home regulators in order to obtain regulatory capital relief, in particular for financial institutions. So in each of the member states' jurisdictions here in the UNCITRAL Commission, your local financial institutions require positive legal opinions on the enforceability of netting in insolvency, for example, and if so, if that is the case, do transactions in new products, such as carbon credits, fall within these parameters of the local legislation that you have. So there's a regulatory requirement to come up with a positive legal analysis in the case of carbon credits, so that this type of market can actually grow based on that enhanced degree of legal certainty. That's the practical reason for market participants why they need to know what the thing is that we are trading. We can talk about details maybe in the questions and answers session. The same goes, apart from insolvency, for the enforceability of collateral arrangements. So is the VCC, is this carbon credit something I can take security over? And that requires a certain legal analysis to be in place. So unless and until this is clarified for each of the jurisdictions around the globe, the legal certainty is not sufficient for trading to happen at scale in this. So from this range of issues, you can see that a number of topics that are addressed by existing global legal standards are affected here. For example, from the UNCITRAL perspective, the legislative guides on insolvency and secure transactions come to mind, but there are several others as well. A couple of model laws, the UNIDRA global netting principle, for example, as well as various instruments produced by the Hague Conference on Private International Law. So it's a plethora of instruments that need to or should address this in one way or another. And there are also very many similarities in substantive legal terms to what has been discussed previously as well, and that's the area of digital assets. So, for example, the UNIDRA digital assets principles are of particular relevance and proximity to this particular topic of carbon credits. So that's why it's great that UNIDRA have started this project in the meantime on assessing the production of a legal instrument to address these points. And it's also very encouraging to see that the various international financial institutions, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, are supporting this. So these issues are obviously also discussed here and have been discussed with UNCITRAL and the Hague Conference. And if I can say it from an industry perspective, the expectation is that the three sisters coordinate among each other as to how best to do the work on this, and to do it in the most quick fashion, if I can put it that way. Given the urgency of the climate challenge, this is a very urgent topic. So, and that's also something the three sisters do routinely in other areas, such as intermediate securities and digital assets that I can remember, for example. So, and then coming to close to the end of my presentation, just to clarify, the proposal from industry is not to discuss or address in any of these projects the regulatory classification of carbon credits. That's a different thing from a different issue from the substantive legal analysis around carbon credits. And we were not talking about the question of which regulator should be in charge of supervising the asset class of carbon here. For example, we're not talking about the question to decide here if a carbon credit is a commodity or a security in the US nomenclature, for example. That's a different thing. And this is also subject to the decision by each of the policymakers and legislators in each of the member states to designate the regulator, the relevant regulator for this. They need to make an informed decision on what this is based on the legal analysis that is provided for in international legal standards on carbon credits. So I understand you have an IOSCO speaker at one of the following sessions, so she will no doubt talk about that. And then finally, I think, given the nature of the markets which have been described earlier already, and the geographical distribution of the jurisdictions of concern here, there is a particular emphasis that's also very close to Isda's heart, which is the need for guidance for emerging market jurisdictions on how to handle this new kind of market in carbon. Most of the bulk, the vast majority of the credits that are generated, which are supposed to be traded back and forth, come from countries in the so-called global south. So that's where the need for legal certainty is particularly high for everybody in the value chain, from the person that runs a carbon project in that particular country, the initial off-taker of that credit that is being generated, as well as those counterparties further down the trading chain when they buy and sell these credits further on. So I don't know if I have some time left still. Yeah, I just wanted to close with a punchline, if I can, a couple of questions that are a little bit more nerdy or legal, if you like, but we are in the right forum here, so in the right audience. So just to summarize, if that hits home. So we've looked at the legal analysis of these carbon credits under various jurisdictions as outlined, and the analysis differs. It's in some countries, some jurisdictions, I should say, it's clearer. In others, it's not so clear. In substantive terms, carbon credits could be intangible assets, as a form of property right in some jurisdictions. In others, it's something else, perhaps a bundle of contractual rights or some sort of administrative law license. So there's some discrepancy to be addressed. And as long as that's not clarified, things like transfer, the security over a credit, and the treatment in insolvency of these credits is unclear. So that's in sort of in specific terms what this means. How is good title obtained? You can't expect market participants to investigate the chain of transactions every time somebody wants to transfer a credit. That's impractical. How should insolvency be dealt with? What's the applicable law following an insolvency? Are those credits within local netting legislation, within the remit? In the cross-border constellation, all of these issues apply for domestic setting of counterparties, a constellation of counterparties, as well as cross-border, of course. And when you have cross-border transactions, it gets even more complicated with the myriad potentially applicable laws. So there's a lot to do. I'm not going to go into the various options, but there are myriad options to define or determine what law might be applicable, and that's a seminar for itself. But I suppose from this description, it might become clearer that there's an urgent need for global guidance by global legal standard setters for their respective member states to form a policy decision, an informed policy decision. So hopefully this will occur after this, and stand ready to discuss this further with you. And with that, I stop here.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think the nerdy part of the discussion goes to the core of what needs to be decided. So I don't remember the last time all panelists stuck to the exact time allocated, and therefore there's actually time for some discussion. And for that, I would open the floor. Anyone has any questions? I see Israel.
Thank you, and we'd like to thank the panelists and for very interesting panels. And I do hope I understood some of the things to report back. And I really appreciated the effort, I think, by Derek not to use initials, because I still didn't understand half of, or almost all of them. But I'm trying. Two questions from our side. First, in consulting with our environmental experts, we understand that currently the Article 6 mechanism, or at least 6.4, is really in its relatively early days. And then the question that came up in our internal discussion is whether there is a point in now, and this is, I think, for everyone, if there is a point in now doing something in UNCITRAL before the Article 6 mechanism is really working. Maybe it's too soon, and we need to see how the mechanism will play out, and only then to see what we can do about it in UNCITRAL. So that's a question. And another question that came up, I think, during the discussion, I'd be happy to hear. We understood that the call for UNCITRAL and UNIDRA and the HCCH to cooperate. As we don't really follow the discussions in UNIDRA, we would be happy to understand, maybe from a different panelist, maybe from the moderator, what could be the additional elements that are missing from the current projects, which UNCITRAL can add even independently, of course in cooperation, but what are the missing element, or is the idea that, and that's also very welcome, I think, that these three sister organizations will work together and will have an outcome product. So we were wondering what that aspect could be. And maybe a final question is whether you believe that states would accept something coercive from UNCITRAL. So if UNCITRAL comes up with a product that forces states to do something, whether they would recognize UNCITRAL as the authority here on this, or whether they'll say, no, it's the competent UNFCCC bodies. And to tell you the truth, the first question that we got when we consulted our environmental colleagues is why is UNCITRAL even dealing with this, and why we couldn't do it in the major body, and all the work that's being done there. Thank you.
Thank you. Unless my colleagues from the UNCITRAL Secretariat tell me otherwise, the last two questions, at least the last one, would seem on its face to be part of the discussion that would take place tomorrow, maybe next week as well, on future work. But so I don't know if they prefer to.
Thanks very much. Yes, indeed, it is envisaged that we have a discussion in the Commission on the outcomes of this colloquium. So the way we planned this colloquium was really to map what the issues are. We have heard of this initiative by UNIDRA, which is one that we had already in our work program as well, so that there is great interest on our part in finding the best way to work together on that. That would make sense, at least, because we're not supposed to duplicate, we're supposed to cooperate. The idea is that we will discuss exactly this value added of how we fit as a UN body which is not there to regulate, how we fit as a, I would say, subcontractor of the broader UNFCCC, which identifies this market mechanism, which says this is how the private sector can contribute. And when you come to the private sector, then, of course, you come into the enabling sphere. And the enabling sphere is what we are working on, and where issues such precisely as the ones that Peter mentioned of what is it, what is this good, this thing that is being traded, how is it, what happens to it when there is an insolvency context, UNCITRAL being the standard setter in insolvency matters. It's absolutely relevant that our contribution comes here for insolvency. The same thing for secure transactions. We have a model law on secure transactions and a very elaborate framework, so it also makes full sense for UNCITRAL to contribute to dealing with how is this going to be addressed in using it as a security. And so, I mean, the pieces of the puzzle, in our view, are being mapped in this colloquium, and then we will put them together when we discuss it in terms of work program and how UNCITRAL is going to contribute with the other organizations. And it shouldn't be only 3 organizations working on it, in my view. When I'm hearing all the points that are being discussed, it's obvious that the Hague conference has an input to make into the applicable law. It's obvious that many other of these international bodies, because I think we are really in a stage where one, it is urgent, and 2, it has to be a collaborative and collective effort. We cannot say, okay, this is something that I do and nobody else does it. We can say we are all going to contribute to that. So that's our view, at least as the Secretariat. Thank you very much. Thank you anyway for putting the question, because it will help us prepare for it for next week. Thank you.
Thank you. As to the first question, I would not venture to answer on behalf of the rest of the panelists, but my understanding also from previous discussion with the industry and with experts is that it is far from being too early. But I would ask maybe Derek to take the question, and maybe Flavia would like to chip in.
Well, I will say that I'm pretty open-minded about this, about the potential role that UNCITRAL could play. Up until now, I think we have benefited mainly in dispute resolution and carbon contracts, where we referenced arbitration provisions, that kind of thing. Going forward, one of the points that I hope I emphasize, I can't really remember what I said, but I hope I emphasize the importance of familiar models as we go from country to country. So in that sense, helping with model, whether it's legislation or just guidance around sort of the key elements that are needed in terms of good governance of carbon markets, kind of taking some of the open questions into account, might be something useful. But I also think that close coordination with the FCCC is important. You don't want to duplicate their work, but I don't see that happening necessarily in that forum. It happens some in the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank in terms of capacity building involvement with host jurisdictions. But in terms of getting something that's kind of like, again, for the business community, going to a jurisdiction to kind of understand, okay, this is the way the process works, and it's similar from country to country, I think that could be a real confidence builder. And so that's why I say I'm kind of open to what the possibilities might be. I think part of it also just depends on how fast or slow you guys are, because you're a new group to me. you are exactly right about how the private sector feels about the FCCC process. Article 6 was agreed in 2015. We finally got guidance on how it was going to be implemented, partial guidance in Glasgow 2 years ago. And we're still working on fine-tuning and standing up the operational elements. And so nobody asked Phil, what year will you get your first issuance of a credit? Whereas these voluntary standards can do it for you tomorrow, kind of thing. So I do think that there's a need for more speed in the system. And if this helped build confidence and helped governments put quality systems together, I think the private sector would welcome it.
I would only add that, as you know, countries are now putting together their nationally determined contributions, which is their carbon budget. So as every country is looking at whether or not they would be able to have any access and sell it on the market, it's very timely to have this discussion and to have this certainty.
It's 2 minutes. Didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
Could I just chime in on the aspect of the comments you got from your colleagues internally from different ministries? The beauty of these international global legal standards is, from an industry perspective, that they nudge governments or authorities to talk to each other. This area of carbon trading is a good example for the need of sort of regulatory authorities that may not talk to each other on a regular basis to actually do so. So if this is about creating a carbon market, it is unlikely that, say, the environmental, energy, or whatever ministry is in charge is aware of all the aspects that come with creating a market, a financial market. So therefore, it appears a good opportunity to talk to their colleagues who are closer on a daily level, to discuss things like regulation, financial markets regulation, or substantive law issues such as insolvency, which is the Ministry of Justice usually. So that's why we like these, or one reason why we like these global standards that come out of UNCITRAL and the sister organization on a regular basis.
Thank you, Peter. I believe there's no time for more questions. We have to stop. So it only remains for me to thank the panelists very much for their excellent contributions and to thank all of you for your attention. Thank you.